The year was 1305. London streets bustled with merchants shouting their prices, horses clattering across cobblestones, and children weaving through the crowd. But on this August morning, something darker was in the air. A different kind of spectacle was about to unfold, one that promised not joy, but blood. Tens of thousands had gathered, drawn by morbid curiosity. Food sellers lined the streets as if it were a holiday. But at the center of it all was not a festival, nor a royal parade. It was a man. William Wallace, the rebel knight of Scotland. To the English crown, he was a traitor who needed to be broken. To his people, he was the living flame of resistance. And on this day, that flame was about to be extinguished, or so the English king believed. What they didn't realize was that Wallace's death would not end his story. It would make him immortal. To understand why Wallace's death shook the world, we must step back into the turbulent landscape of late 13th century Scotland. Scotland was not yet a united nation as we imagine today. It was a land of fractured loyalties, shifting alliances, and nobles torn between survival and honor. When the Scottish king died without an heir, England's monarch, Edward I, remembered as Longshanks, seized the opportunity. To him, Scotland was not an independent kingdom but a rebellious province waiting to be subdued. Edward was no ordinary ruler. He was ruthless, calculated, and merciless. He had already crushed Wales into submission and expelled the Jewish community from England. For him, rebellion was like fire. It had to be extinguished completely, or it would spread. In this chaos rose William Wallace. He was not a nobleman with ambition for the throne. He was a minor landowner, shaped by personal tragedy and fueled by rage at English oppression. His family had suffered. His homeland had been humiliated. Wallace chose not silence, but the sword. In 1297, at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, he achieved what many thought impossible. With poorly armed commoners, he defeated the armored cavalry of England, the most feared military force of its age. That victory was not only tactical, it was symbolic. It proved that Scotland could stand against the might of England, and that freedom was not just a dream whispered in the dark, but a possibility forged in blood. But victories inspire not only hope, they invite vengeance. Edward I would not forgive. He understood that Wallace's defiance had to be reversed, not merely in battle, but in memory. Wallace could not simply be killed. He had to be erased. 4 years, Wallace lived like a ghost. He slipped through forests, sheltered in hidden valleys, and relied on the loyalty of a few who still dared to stand with him. To the English crown, he was more than an outlaw. He was unfinished business. Every day that Wallace drew breath was a reminder that Scotland had once defied England, and might do so again. Edward's spies and informants spread across the land. Gold and promises were offered to anyone willing to betray him. Fear was a powerful ally of the English king, and gradually the net tightened. Former comrades drifted away. Allies chose silence. To harbor Wallace was to invite death. The end came, as it so often does in history, not on the battlefield, but through betrayal. In August of 1305, near Glasgow, Wallace was seized. Historians believe it was through the treachery of Sir John de Menteith, a Scottish knight who had bent the knee to Edward. Bound in chains, Wallace was paraded southward. The journey itself was punishment. Town after town, he was displayed to jeering crowds, dragged as though already half dead. This was psychological warfare, calculated humiliation. The man who had once led armies was now reduced to a spectacle, stripped of dignity but not of defiance. By the time he reached London, Wallace had already endured weeks of degradation. Yet his true ordeal, the carefully staged destruction of his body and spirit, was only about to begin. On August 23, 1305, Westminster Hall filled with officials, guards, and curious onlookers. At its center stood William Wallace, chains biting into his flesh, yet his gaze unbroken. The charges were read aloud in Latin, a language Wallace likely did not understand. He was accused of treason, murder, sacrilege, and arson. Each word carried the weight of death. But there was an irony so sharp it cut deeper than any sword. Wallace was accused of betraying a king he had never sworn loyalty to. To him, Edward of England was no sovereign, but a foreign tyrant. When given the chance to speak, Wallace declared. "I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject." His words struck like lightning, defiant, unwavering. Yet the verdict had been written long before the trial began. The court was not seeking truth. It was staging a performance. And its final act would be Wallace's annihilation. The sentence was pronounced with cold precision, as though cruelty itself had been codified into law. William Wallace would be dragged through the streets of London. He would be hanged by the neck, but not until death released him. Still alive, he would be cut open, his organs torn from his body and burned before his eyes. His head would be severed, his body quartered. Every stage carried symbolic meaning. The dragging was meant to degrade him, stripping away honor. The hanging declared his rejection by both heaven and earth. The disembowelment marked him as corrupted at the core. And the quartering, the final mutilation, was designed to erase him completely, scattering his remains so that no grave, no shrine, no memory could remain intact. This was not execution. It was erasure. A punishment crafted not only to end Wallace's life, but to extinguish the very idea of defiance he represented. The morning of August 23, 1305, dawned warm and clear. London awoke not to ordinary business, but to spectacle. Word had spread across the city for days. Scaffolds had been erected, merchants had set up stalls, and crowds poured in from the countryside. For the authorities, this was more than justice, it was theater. For the people, it was entertainment. Wallace was bound to a wooden hurdle, his body stretched and tied. Horses dragged him across the cobblestones of London, from the Tower to Smithfield. The rough stones tore his flesh. Dust clung to the blood that streaked his skin. Along the way, the crowd jeered and hurled refuse, as though mocking not just the man, but the idea of resistance itself. Yet Wallace's eyes, witnesses said, remained fixed forward, silent, defiant. At Smithfield, thousands pressed in for the best view. Vendors sold pies and ale, turning horror into carnival. Children climbed onto shoulders. Laughter mingled with anticipation. This was a holiday of blood. The executioner began. Wallace was hanged by the neck, the rope cutting into him, his body convulsing as air fled his lungs. But death was denied him. Before darkness could claim him, the rope was cut. He collapsed, gasping, alive, conscious, condemned to suffer more. Then came the knife. Before the crowd, the executioner sliced open his abdomen. His organs were pulled out, one by one, held aloft like trophies before being cast into a waiting fire. Smoke rose. The smell of burning flesh drifted through the air, mingling with the cheers of the onlookers. In medieval thought, the entrails were the seat of compassion. By burning them before Wallace's eyes, the executioner symbolically destroyed his humanity. Still, witnesses claimed, Wallace never begged. He did not plead for mercy. His silence was louder than screams, a final act of defiance even as his body was dismantled. At last, his head was severed with a single stroke of the axe. The ordeal was over. But the spectacle was not. The executioner lifted the head high, blood dripping, so that every eye could see. Then his body was quartered, arms, legs, torso hacked apart, each piece displayed to the delighted crowd as though carved from butcher's meat. Wallace's head was dipped in tar and mounted on London Bridge, to stare down at all who entered the city. His limbs were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, grim reminders nailed up for all Scotland to see. It was meant to be annihilation. Yet in their cruelty, the English king and his servants had forged something unintended, not the erasure of a man, but the creation of a martyr. When the axe finally fell, Edward I believed he had won. The rebel knight was gone, his body scattered, his memory disgraced. The spectacle had been designed to terrify, an unforgettable warning to all who might dream of defiance. For a brief moment, it seemed to work. Some Scots submitted. Others fled into exile. Many nobles, already weary of endless war, convinced themselves that resistance was futile. But terror has limits. What Edward miscalculated was the power of memory. Wallace's death did not erase him, it transformed him. The cruelty of his execution burned itself into the Scottish mind, not as proof of English strength, but as proof of English tyranny. Among those who watched and listened was Robert the Bruce. In time, he would rise to lead Scotland, carrying forward the torch that Wallace had lit. Wallace's brutal end served not as a deterrent, but as an inspiration, a reminder that submission was worse than death. In taverns and cottages, stories spread. Wallace had not begged. He had not surrendered his dignity. He had endured the unendurable, and in doing so, turned shame into honor. Each retelling turned pain into pride, despair into defiance. Edward had sought to make Wallace an example. He succeeded, but not in the way he intended. Instead of extinguishing rebellion, he gave it a martyr. Instead of breaking the Scottish spirit, he welded it together in shared memory. History is filled with such ironies. The tools of terror may crush bodies, but they cannot control meaning. In trying to erase Wallace, Edward immortalized him. The execution ground at Smithfield became not the grave of a cause, but the birthplace of a legend. What, then, do we learn from a death so brutal, so carefully staged to strip away dignity? At first glance, William Wallace's fate seems only tragic, a man broken by the machinery of empire, torn apart before a jeering crowd. But look closer, and the meaning shifts. For Wallace's story is not just about death. It is about choice. When the rope was tightened, when the knife cut deep, Wallace could have begged. He could have pleaded for mercy, cursed his enemies, or recanted his cause. But he chose silence. He chose defiance. That choice made his death not merely suffering, but sacrifice. And this is where the lesson lives. Every man faces his own execution ground, not always with swords or axes, but with the quieter tortures of life: humiliation, failure, betrayal, compromise. We are all dragged through our own streets of London at times, paraded before the world's contempt. The question is not whether pain will come. The question is how we face it. Wallace teaches us that dignity is stronger than death. That principle can outlast flesh. He reminds us that the worth of a life is not measured in years survived, but in values upheld. For modern men, the battlefield may look different, but the choice is the same. Do we cling to safety, even if it means surrendering our integrity? Or do we hold to our convictions, even when it costs us? The English crown believed it had annihilated a rebel. Instead, it forged a legend. 7 centuries later, Wallace's name is spoken not with pity, but with reverence. His executioners are forgotten. His silence is remembered. And so, when life drags us low, when the world demands our surrender, Wallace whispers across the centuries: stand firm. Endure. Some things are worth any price. On that August day in 1305, William Wallace's body was torn apart, his remains scattered to the corners of the kingdom. Yet more than 700 years later, his story still breathes. His death, meant to silence, became a voice louder than any shout. His suffering, meant to humiliate, became the seed of a nation's pride. Wallace reminds us that freedom, dignity, and honor are never free. They are bought at terrible cost. And though few of us will ever face the executioner's axe, each of us must decide where we will stand when life demands a price. So I ask you, the listener, when your own trial comes, when the world tempts you to bend, to betray, to surrender, what will you choose? Safety in silence, or immortality in conviction? For in the end, Wallace's story is not just history. It is a mirror. And the reflection asks us all, what is your freedom worth?